What if the absolute power you spent 25 years building suddenly turns around and devours the very billionaires who put you on the throne? Deep inside the grand halls of the Kremlin, a quiet revolution of fear is underway, as Russia's elite watch their fortunes vanish overnight into the jaws of a desperate war machine. Before we pull back the curtain on how billions are fleeing through shadow networks right now, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with everyone who wants to understand the brutal realities of modern geopolitics. For more than 2 decades, the unwritten pact between Vladimir Putin and Russia's wealthiest men was the bedrock of the entire political system. It was an arrangement born out of the economic chaos of the 1990s and perfected inside the Kremlin walls. The rules were simple, uncompromising, and crystal clear to every oligarch who controlled the nation's immense natural wealth. Stay completely out of national politics, never challenge the authority of the central state, and obey every directive coming from the top. In return, you will be allowed to amass unbelievable fortunes, build global corporate monopolies, purchase super yachts anchored off the coast of France, and buy sprawling estates across Western Europe. This pact turned a small group of businessmen into multi-billionaires who felt entirely untouchable. They operated in a world of absolute luxury, insulated from the daily struggles of ordinary citizens, while using the immense power of the Russian state to crush domestic competition. But that golden era came to a sudden, violent end the moment Russian military columns crossed into Ukraine in February 2022. Western sanctions hit like an economic tsunami, instantly freezing offshore bank accounts, seizing luxury mansions in London and Miami, and impounding massive super yachts in foreign ports. Yet, the most dangerous threat to Russia's billionaire class was not coming from Western capitals. The real peril was brewing inside Moscow itself. As the military conflict had dragged on into a prolonged war of attrition, the financial cost of sustaining the Russian war economy began to reach unsustainable levels. The Kremlin found itself staring down a massive budget deficit, aggravated by shrinking energy revenues and soaring defense spending. To understand why the Russian state turned its sights on its own wealthy elites, one must look at the devastating economic blows landed directly against the country's strategic backbone. In recent months, targeted long-range drone strikes have struck deep inside Russian territory, focusing with mathematical precision on the nation's energy infrastructure. Strategic strikes knocked out over 40% of Russia's total oil refining capacity in a matter of weeks. 8 major oil refineries suffered severe structural damage, and dozens of fuel storage depots were turned into burning infernos. The direct financial damage to the Russian energy sector quickly exceeded $13.5 billion, leaving major industrial regions struggling with severe fuel deficits. When oil refineries go dark, the financial ripple effects hit the federal treasury almost immediately. The Kremlin faced a staggering deficit of roughly 1 trillion rubles in expected oil and gas revenues. To keep energy companies operational and prevent gas stations across the nation from running completely dry, the state was forced to hand out nearly $10 billion in direct emergency subsidies to domestic oil firms in just a 2-month period, with war expenditures consuming over 40% of the federal budget and traditional energy. Profits collapsing, Putin urgently needed to plug this massive financial hole. The target was obvious. The Kremlin set its sights on the largest pool of liquid wealth remaining in the country, the private fortunes of the oligarchs. The moment these billionaires realized that the state was coming to seize their private wealth, a historic, panic-stricken exodus began. What followed was one of the largest and most secretive flights of capital in modern history. According to detailed financial reports and insider accounts published by global media organizations like Bloomberg, Russia's wealthiest figures began quietly moving billions of dollars out of the country. Among those desperately seeking exit routes for their assets were individuals sitting directly inside Putin's inner circle. Capital flowing out of Russia through unrecorded channels reached tens of billions of dollars in a remarkably short period, completely surpassing the capital flight recorded during the previous year. To grasp the scale of this financial panic, it helps to look at the broader historical picture. Capital flight has been a persistent drain on the Russian economy for decades. Between the early 2000s and 2021, nearly $800 billion in total wealth fled the country as elites moved their profits to offshore safe havens. In 2022 alone, an astonishing $250 billion left the country in a single year. But the flight happening right now is fundamentally different. It is not an effort to diversify investments or purchase luxury real estate for status. It is a desperate attempt to save fortunes from total state confiscation. The destination of this fleeing capital has shifted dramatically. The money is no longer flowing into traditional Western banks in London, Zurich, or New York, which are now strictly blocked by sanctions and asset tracing networks. Instead, Russian elites have pivoted entirely toward non-Western financial safe havens. Portfolios have rapidly shifted into digital assets, physical gold bullion, high-end real estate in non-aligned countries, and private investment vehicles across the Gulf states. Dubai has emerged as the absolute capital of this new financial migration, offering a combination of zero tax rates, world-class luxury, and complete neutrality regarding Western sanctions. The United Arab Emirates has become the primary refuge for fleeing Russian capital. Today, between 5 and 10% of Dubai's total foreign population is made up of Russian nationals. Demand for luxury villas and high-end commercial properties in the city has skyrocketed. At the same time, Dubai's status as a global cryptocurrency hub provides the perfect mechanism for converting ruble fortunes into digital assets and moving funds across borders without leaving a paper trail. Beyond the Persian Gulf, secondary escape routes have opened up across Turkey, Cyprus, and Saudi Arabia. Rich Russians are buying luxury residential real estate in Istanbul and Monaco, while others are investing in agricultural and mining projects as far away as Africa to reduce their reliance on the domestic Russian market. But the most ingenious and shadow-bound method of moving money relies on a financial tool created within Russia's own state apparatus. When international sanctions cut Russian banks off from standard global transfer networks, the Kremlin engineered its own alternative. It developed a specialized ruble-pegged cryptocurrency named A7A5, designed specifically to bypass Western financial blockades. The figures behind the system illustrate the true nature of the operation. A controlling interest in the platform belongs to Ilan Shor, a fugitive businessman convicted in a massive $1 billion bank fraud scheme in Moldova. The remaining stake is held by Pромsvyazbank, a heavily sanctioned state bank that directly serves as the central financial engine for the Russian defense industry. In practice, A7A5 functions as a state-sponsored sanction evasion vehicle operating under the guise of a private digital asset. The sheer volume moving through this network is breathtaking. Statements from banking executives reveal that in the first half of 2025 alone, transaction volumes through A7A5 reached approximately $96 billion. This entire shadow infrastructure operates through non-aligned neighbor states such as Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Kazakhstan, which fall outside the jurisdiction of Western regulators. Through these gray financial corridors, tens of billions of dollars flow silently, allowing wealthy individuals and state-linked entities to move funds out of Russia under the radar. If you appreciate deep, independent analyses that uncover the hidden truths behind world events, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this economic breakdown. The rapid growth of these shadow transfer routes highlights a deeper reality that the Kremlin cannot obscure. The very people who know the Russian state best are the ones running fastest to escape its reach. Why are individuals who hold immense domestic power fleeing their own nation with such extreme urgency? The primary driver behind this frantic flight is a deep, overwhelming fear that the Kremlin is systematically expropriating the private wealth of its own elite. That fear is backed up by cold, hard facts. According to official statements from Russian Prosecutor General Alexander Gutsen, the state seized private assets valued at over $51.5 billion within a single 12-month period. When added to earlier confiscations carried out since the start of the war, total private property seized by the state has reached approximately $90 billion. The victims of this nationalization drive are not minor executives or political dissidents. They are billionaires at the absolute pinnacle of Russian industry. Take the case of Vadim Moshkovich, the founder of agricultural titan Rusagro, who once ranked 51st on the Forbes list of Russia's wealthiest individuals. Today, Moshkovich sits inside a state prison cell while the government moves to strip him of his agricultural empire, valued at roughly $7.5 billion. An equally dramatic fate befell Konstantin Strukov, a gold mining magnate who controlled one of the largest precious metal producers in the nation. Strukov had previously been awarded a prestigious state medal by Putin himself for his services to the Russian economy. Yet, as the state moved to seize his gold company and revoke his official paperwork, Strukov was intercepted at an airport while trying to flee to Turkey. Similarly, Dmitry Kamenchik, the owner of Moscow's Domodedovo International Airport, lost operational control over his massive infrastructure assets as state prosecutors stepped in. The real-world consequences of these seizures have been swift and uncompromising. Exactly 3 prominent billionaires were abruptly erased from the Forbes Russia Rich list in a single year as a direct result of state confiscations. Business analysts note that while these seizures are publicly presented as anti-corruption campaigns or legal reviews of historic privatizations, they function in practice as a systematic mechanism for transferring national wealth directly into the hands of the state and its military apparatus. Since 2024, prosecutors have focused heavily on 2 distinct categories of wealthy business owners: The first group includes businessmen who hold dual citizenship or retain close ties to foreign nations through offshore investments. The second group consists of individuals who previously held public office or managed state-owned enterprises during the privatization waves of the 1990s. For these figures, holding substantial private assets inside Russian jurisdiction has become an existential risk. Yet, direct state confiscation is only one side of the nightmare facing Russia's business elite. At the same time, the national banking system is suffering under severe economic strain. European intelligence reports and economic assessments indicate that Russian commercial banks are facing an explosive systemic crisis. Banks are being crushed under the weight of high interest rates, war spending, and artificial credit expansion, with roughly 10% of all corporate loans carrying a severe risk of default. When arbitrary state seizures combine with a fragile banking system, every major business owner is left asking the exact same question: am I next? The climate of fear reached its absolute peak during a secret, closed-door meeting held in Moscow on March 26, 2026. Vladimir Putin gathered the nation's most powerful corporate leaders and industrial titans inside the Kremlin. What was said in that room sent chills through the entire billionaire class. Putin placed the war effort squarely on the table, making it clear that he was determined to fight until all military objectives were met, regardless of the economic cost. The message was impossible to misunderstand. The war would go on indefinitely, and the private sector would be required to finance it. The trap had already been set the day before the meeting. Igor Sechin, the head of state oil giant Rosneft and one of Putin's closest allies, sent a formal letter to the Kremlin proposing that the business community raise funds for the war effort by purchasing special military bonds. When the oligarchs walked into that meeting room, they were stepping into a pre-planned financial trap. The most crucial moment arrived when billionaire Suleiman Kerimov spoke up. Kerimov proposed that the wealthiest businessmen should make substantial, voluntary financial contributions directly to the state treasury. He justified this by arguing that most Russian fortunes had been built during the chaotic 1990s with state help anyway, meaning the money ultimately belonged to the state. Kerimov pledged approximately $1.2 billion of his personal fortune on the spot, and metals magnate Oleg Deripaska quickly followed suit. What generated true terror among the executives in the room was Putin's reaction. Putin welcomed the idea of voluntary donations with visible satisfaction. That satisfaction was an alarm bell for everyone present. It signaled that the Kremlin was no longer satisfied with seizing the assets of individual disgraced figures. It was now levying a direct tribute on the entire elite class to fund the war. Under the guise of volunteerism, these mandatory contributions reached a staggering $3 billion in just a few months. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov publicly denied that any coercion was involved, asserting that Putin had not demanded payments from anyone. But in modern Russia, no fortune is large enough or secure enough to remain outside Putin's reach. This situation brings us to a fundamental question that puzzles many international observers. If these billionaires possess so much wealth and control major industries, why don't they unite, combine their resources, and stand up against Putin? 2. Understand why an oligarch revolt will never happen. One must look at the insights of Bill Browder, a man who knows the inner dynamics of Russian wealth better than almost anyone in the West. If you find this deep dive into global power structures and economic strategy valuable, take a quick second to hit that share button, send this video to your group chats, and subscribe to join our growing community of informed viewers. Bill Browder was once the largest foreign investor in Russia. But after he began exposing high-level Kremlin corruption, he was declared a national security threat and banned from entering the country in 2005. Shortly after, his tax lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, uncovered a massive $230 million fraud scheme carried out by state officials. Magnitsky was arrested, held in brutal conditions, and died in a Moscow prison in 2009. Since that day, Browder has dedicated his life to fighting the Putin regime, pioneering the Magnitsky sanctions laws that stand today as one of the West's most potent economic weapons against Russian officials. Browder's assessment completely shatters the most widespread misconception in Western political commentary. Many observers assume that as economic pressure and state confiscations mount, the oligarchs will eventually band together and say enough to Putin. Browder states with absolute certainty that this will never happen. The reason comes down to a single fundamental word: dependency. In Browder's striking explanation, there is a fundamental difference between wealth in the West and wealth in Russia. In a Western rule of law democracy, if you have money, you possess independent wealth. That money belongs to you, it is protected by independent courts, and no political leader can simply strip it away without legal due process. In Russia, no amount of money makes you independent. Every wealthy individual exists in a state of absolute, total dependency. There is only one person who ultimately controls their assets, their freedom, and their lives: Vladimir Putin. At any moment he chooses, Putin can take away a billionaire's corporate empire, toss him into a penal colony, or eliminate him entirely. This is why, no matter how powerful these tycoons may appear on paper, they turn into the most submissive individuals imaginable when standing before Putin. To understand how this absolute submission was engineered, one must go back over 20 years to the exact moment this fear was permanently burned into the minds of the Russian elite. In October 2003, Putin ordered the dramatic arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was then the wealthiest man in Russia. Khodorkovsky, the owner of oil titan Yukos, had dared to fund political opposition parties and publicly challenge Kremlin policies on national television. The scene recounted by Browder was seared into the memory of every billionaire in the nation. During his trial, Khodorkovsky, the most powerful corporate figure in the country, was locked inside an iron cage in a Moscow courtroom in front of global television cameras. That image was a direct, unmistakable message broadcast to every oligarch in Russia. Stay out of politics, stay completely loyal, or this will be your fate. The terms of the pact were frozen in stone that day. The oligarchs could keep their wealth and luxury as long as they remained completely submissive to political power. Anyone who dared to breach that agreement paid a heavy price. Some were thrown into prison camps like Khodorkovsky, while others, like Boris Berezovsky, died under mysterious circumstances in foreign exile. This historical trauma is why today's oligarchs will never revolt. They are not an independent political class. They are terrified individuals trying to save themselves. Yet, there was a time when these same billionaires lived a picture-perfect existence. They flew around the world on private jets, anchored massive super yachts along the Amalfi Coast, and moved effortlessly between alpine ski chalets and luxury villas in London. Wherever they went in the West, they were greeted with immense deference by bankers, real estate moguls, and politicians eager for their capital. In 2022, that glamorous world collapsed completely. Western authorities began relentlessly tracking down and seizing high-value assets belonging to sanctioned elites. Metals, magnate Alexei Mordashov's superyacht Lady M was impounded in Italy, while billionaire Viktor Vekselberg's luxury vessel, Tango, was seized in Spain. The most dramatic pursuit involved Suleiman Karimov's $300 million mega-yacht, the Amadea. As its crew tried to navigate it to safe waters, international law enforcement hunted the vessel across the Pacific Ocean, eventually seizing it in the Fiji Islands under a U.S. warrant. Today, life for Russia's business elite has turned into a state of geopolitical confinement. They can no longer travel to Europe, the United Kingdom, or the United States without facing immediate arrest or asset seizure. For many, major foreign bank accounts remain completely frozen, making even basic financial management a nightmare. They are forced to live in non-aligned cities like Dubai, enjoying comfort in a gilded cage while the regime that made them rich wages a destructive war at home. Furthermore, the legal mechanisms targeting shadow Russian wealth are tightening with every passing month. A major turning point occurred when the United States implemented secondary sanctions against foreign financial institutions. Washington announced that any international bank facilitating transactions for entities linked to the Russian defense sector would face complete exclusion from the U.S. financial system. The impact of this measure was immediate and severe. Major banks in the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and China began halting ruble transactions and closing accounts held by Russian citizens. While moving money out of Russia is not completely impossible today, the window has narrowed significantly. Opening a foreign bank account now requires months of strict compliance checks, detailed financial records tracing wealth back decades, and explicit risk approvals. Even holding a second passport from a Caribbean nation or a European jurisdiction no longer provides an automatic shield. Immigration consultants report that Russian applicants face intense due diligence, strict source of funds checks, and extended processing times. In many countries, residency applications now require case-by-case political clearance before approval. The absolute proof of this international crackdown lies in an official legal action taken by the United States Department of the Treasury. The Office of Foreign Assets Control imposed a record fine of over $215 million on GVA Capital, a San Francisco-based venture capital firm. This represented the maximum penalty permitted by law. The firm was penalized for continuing to manage investments on behalf of a sanctioned Russian oligarch, the very same Suleiman Karimov, whose superyacht was seized in Fiji and who pledged over $1 billion at the Kremlin meeting. The legal rationale published by U.S. regulators summed up the new era. Sanctions are now directly targeting the financial gatekeepers, including venture capital managers, accountants, lawyers, and corporate service providers. This enforcement action fundamentally altered the equation for Russia's wealthy elite. The main problem is no longer just finding a place to hide money, but finding any reputable financial professional willing to touch it. For an international lawyer or fund manager, the risk of facing hundreds of millions of dollars in fines or prison time far outweighs any potential commission fee. As legitimate global financial doors slam shut, Russian capital is forced into increasingly risky, expensive, and untraceable shadow networks, caught between the Kremlin's insatiable appetite for confiscation on one side and closing doors abroad on the other. The Russian billionaire is trapped in a vice. They cannot stay in Russia without risking total asset seizure, yet they cannot fully integrate to the international financial system either. Looking at this picture of internal predation and international isolation, it is easy to draw the conclusion that Putin's regime is on the verge of an immediate economic collapse. But a thorough analysis reveals a much more complex and resilient reality. Despite all the Western sanctions, asset seizures, and massive capital flight, the Russian state has managed to keep its core economic engine running for years. Russia successfully redirected its trade away from the West toward major Eastern economies like China, India, and Turkey. To transport its crude oil without relying on Western maritime services or insurance, the Kremlin assembled a massive shadow fleet of hundreds of aging tankers operating under flags of convenience. As a result, the state largely succeeded in preserving the critical oil revenues needed to fund its war effort and maintain domestic stability. The most striking proof of this economic resilience is visible in the figures tracking total billionaire wealth inside Russia itself. Despite heavy capital flight, widespread asset seizures, and harsh international sanctions, the combined wealth of Russian billionaires actually surpassed pre-war levels, reaching exactly $697 billion. Moreover, the total number of billionaires in the country has actually increased rather than decreased. How this is possible reveals a paradoxical reality. State asset seizures actually strengthen Putin's control. When the Kremlin confiscates an enterprise from a disgraced oligarch or takes over a foreign company's domestic assets, that physical property does not vanish. It is simply transferred to a new, highly compliant tier of loyal insiders who have proven their absolute devotion to the regime. A new generation of state-backed elites is being created, enriching themselves by managing nationalized assets under the watchful eye of the state security apparatus. All of this leads to a clear and definitive conclusion. Although the number of billionaires in Russia remains high, their influence over state policy and political decision-making has been completely obliterated. Putin has stripped the oligarchs of every shred of independence, compelling them to serve the strategic priorities of the war economy. Returning to the central question, no, the oligarchs will not overthrow Putin. As Bill Browder stated, they possess neither the azita, independent power, nor the personal courage to do so. Capital flight and elite panic are not signs of an impending revolution. They are the symptoms of a profound systemic distrust in the long-term future of the nation. What we are witnessing is not a sudden, explosive collapse of the regime, but a prolonged, grinding decay of the national economic framework. The ultimate threat to the state is not a palace coup led by discontented billionaires, but the slow erosion of the domestic economy, soaring inflation, labor shortages, and the endless strain placed on ordinary citizens. The golden age of the untouchable Russian oligarch is officially over, replaced by a system where every fortune exists solely to feed the war machine until nothing is left.